The forecast said -12, but Marcus didn't care. He'd been planning this trip for 6 months, 3 days alone on Lake of the Woods. No cell service, no wife asking about bills, no boss emailing about quarterly reports. Just him, a rented ice house, a case of beer and walleye. He arrived at the access point just after noon on a Friday in late January. The sky was a flat gray sheet, and the wind came in low and mean across the frozen expanse. The lake stretched out before him like a white desert, endless, featureless, silent. The outfitter, an old Norwegian named Arne, had already hauled the ice house out to Marcus's spot, about 2 miles from shore. Marcus could see it in the distance, a tiny red rectangle against all that white. "You're the only one out this far this weekend," Arne said, handing Marcus the keys to the small propane heater inside. "Most folks stay closer to the resort." "That's the point," Marcus said. Arne didn't smile. His eyes, pale blue and watery from decades of wind, lingered on Marcus for a moment too long. "You hear anything strange out there, you just ignore it." Marcus laughed. "Like what?" Arne didn't answer. He climbed back into his truck, and Marcus watched the taillights disappear down the access road until he was completely alone. The walk out to the ice house took 40 minutes. By the time Marcus arrived, his face was numb and his lungs ached from the cold. But inside, the little structure was cozy enough. 8 feet by 6 feet, a bench along one wall, a small cot. 2 holes already drilled in the floor, dark water visible below. The propane heater hissed to life, and within an hour the temperature inside was almost comfortable. Marcus set up his lines, cracked open a beer, and watched the holes. The first few hours passed quietly. He caught 2 small perch, threw them back. The light outside faded from gray to purple to black. The wind picked up, rattling the thin walls of the ice house. Marcus ate a cold sandwich, drank another beer, and listened to the sounds of the ice. That was something people who'd never been ice fishing didn't understand. How loud the ice could be. It groaned, it cracked, it sang, almost in deep harmonic tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lake was alive beneath him, constantly shifting, settling, breathing. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus heard the first tap. It came from directly below him, a single deliberate knock against the underside of the ice. He froze, beer halfway to his lips. Tap. There it was again. Right beneath his feet, Marcus leaned forward, staring into the dark water of the fishing hole. The hole was about 10 inches wide, and the water below was black as ink. He couldn't see more than a few inches down. Tap, tap. His heart began to beat faster. He told himself it was a fish, a big walleye maybe, bumping against the ice, or the ice itself shifting, creating sounds that only seemed directional. But then he heard it. Again, and this time, it wasn't a tap. It was a drag, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something running a fingernail along the underside of the ice, moving from one side of the house to the other. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked over his beer. The liquid spread across the plywood floor, seeping toward the fishing holes. The scraping stopped. Silence. He stood there for a long time, listening. The heater hissed. The wind moaned. The ice groaned in the distance. Nothing else. Marcus laughed at himself, a shaky, unconvincing sound, and sat back down. He cleaned up the spilled beer. He checked his lines. He told himself he was being ridiculous. But he didn't sleep well that night, and just before dawn, when the sky was beginning to lighten from black to gray, he heard it again. 3 slow taps directly beneath his cot. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Marcus told himself he'd leave in the morning. But when the sun came up, weak and pale, barely cresting the tree-line miles away, everything seemed different. The fear of the night felt absurd. He'd driven 6 hours for this trip, paid good money for the ice house rental, He wasn't going to run home because of some sounds in the ice. He made coffee on the small propane stove and fished through the morning. Caught a decent walleye, then another. By noon, he'd almost forgotten about the tapping. Almost. Around 2 in the afternoon, he decided to walk out onto the lake. He needed to stretch his legs, clear his head. The day was warmer than the previous one. Still below zero, but the wind had died down, and the sun occasionally broke through the clouds. Marcus walked about 100 yards from the ice house and stopped. There was something in the ice. At first he thought it was a fish, a big one frozen just beneath the surface. But as he got closer, kneeling down, brushing away the thin layer of snow, he realized it wasn't a fish. It was a hand, a human hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, frozen about, 6 inches below the surface of the ice. The skin was gray-white, bloated. Marcus scrambled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He stared at the hand for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then he noticed the other shapes, scattered across the ice, visible now that he knew what to look for. Dark forms beneath the white surface. Some were close to the top, almost reachable. Others were deeper, just shadows. Bodies, dozens of them, frozen beneath the lake. Marcus ran. He ran back to the ice house, grabbed his phone. No signal, of course, there was never any signal, and packed his bag with shaking hands. He didn't care about the fishing gear, didn't care about the deposit on the rental. He just needed to get back to shore, back to his truck, back to anywhere but here. He stepped outside and stopped. The ice house was surrounded by holes, dozens of them. Fishing holes drilled in a perfect circle around the structure, each one about 10 inches wide. They hadn't been there that morning. He was certain of it. He would have noticed. And from each hole, the dark waters stared up at him like an eye. Marcus didn't think. He just moved. He picked a direction, toward shore, he hoped, and walked as fast as he could without running. Running on ice was dangerous. Running on ice with holes everywhere was suicide. Behind him, he heard it. Splash. He didn't turn around. Splash, splash. Something was coming out of the holes. Marcus broke into a run. His boots slipped on the ice, and he nearly fell twice, but he kept going. The shore was still over a mile away, a dark line of trees against the white horizon. He heard the sounds behind him, wet, slapping sounds like bare feet on ice. And breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing that wasn't his own. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The tree line grew closer, half a mile, a quarter mile. The sounds stopped. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder. The ice behind him was empty, white and flat, and featureless all the way back to the tiny red dot of the ice house in the distance. Nothing there. He made it to shore, made it to his truck, made it to the highway before he allowed himself to stop shaking. He never went back for his gear. The outfitter, Arne, called him twice the following week. Marcus didn't answer. On the third call, Arne left a voicemail. Found your stuff. Found the holes too. Figured you'd seen 'em. A long pause. You're lucky, friend. Most folks who see 'em don't make it back to shore. Another pause. They don't like it when people see. The voicemail ended. Marcus deleted it. He sold all his ice fishing gear the following month. He never returned to Minnesota. Some nights when the house is quiet and he's lying in bed, he still hears it. Tap, 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 right beneath him, as if something is still waiting, just below the surface. The old Cajun at the bait shop didn't want to rent Eli the boat. Eli could tell by the way the man's eyes shifted when he mentioned where he wanted to go, the way his weathered hands paused over the register, the way he sucked his teeth and stared out the window at the brown water sliding past the dock. Bayou Sorrel's fine, the old man said. Henderson too, good fishing, plenty of catfish, bass, sacolate. I want to go deeper, Eli said, past the pipeline canal, into the dead water. The old man's jaw tightened. Ain't nothing back there worth catching. My grandfather used to fish back there, said it was the best spot in the basin. Your grandfather from around here? Bro Bridge, born and raised. The old man studied Eli for a long moment. Eli was 34, an accountant from Houston, but his mother had been Louisiana-born, and he still carried traces of it in his face. The dark eyes, the olive skin, the black hair that curled in humidity. What was his name? The old man asked. Thibodeau, Clement Thibodeau. Something flickered in the old man's expression. Recognition, maybe, or something else. Clement's grandson, he murmured. Well, he rented Eli the boat, a flat-bottomed aluminum John boat with a 25-horse outboard, but he didn't seem happy about it. As Eli loaded his gear, the old man stood on the dock, arms crossed, watching. You got a phone? He asked. Yeah. Won't work out there, no signal past the pipeline. I figured. You got a gun? Eli hesitated. No. The old man disappeared into the shop and came back with a short-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. He handed them to Eli without a word. I can't take this, Eli said. You're going into the dead water. You'll take it. Eli looked at the gun, then at the old man. What's out there? The old man's eyes drifted to the water. The Spanish moss hanging from the cypress trees swayed in a breeze Eli couldn't feel. Something that don't like visitors. The first hour was beautiful. Eli motored through the basin, following the channels his grandfather had described in the old letters Eli had found after his mother died. The water was dark but clear, tea-colored from the tannins leaching out of the cypress trees. Egrets stood motionless in the shallows. A gator slid off a log as he passed, disappearing without a ripple. He passed the pipeline canal around noon and entered the dead water. The change was immediate. The cypress trees grew thicker here, their trunks wider, their knees jutting from the water like broken bones. The Spanish moss hung lower, brushing the surface, creating curtains of gray-green that he had to push through. The air was heavier, wetter, harder to breathe, and it was quiet. That was the thing Eli noticed most. In the main basin, the swamp was alive with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, fish jumping. But here, in the dead water, there was nothing, just the low gurgle of his outboard and the slap of water against the hull. He cut the engine and drifted. The silence pressed against his ears. He found the spot his grandfather had described, a small island, maybe half an acre, with a collapsed wooden structure at its center. A fishing camp, decades abandoned. The wood was gray and rotted, the tin roof half submerged in the undergrowth. Eli tied off the boat and stepped onto the island. The ground was soft, spongy, uncertain beneath his boots. He made his way to the old camp and looked inside. Nothing but shadows and decay. A rusted stove, a collapsed cot, empty bottles, labels long since rotted away. But on the wall, carved into the wood, he saw something that made him stop. Names, dozens of them, carved in shaky letters. Some were old, the cuts dark and weathered. Others looked newer, the wood still pale where the knife had bitten. And at the bottom, fresher than the rest, Clement Thibodeau, 1987, his grandfather's name, the year he disappeared. Eli's mother had always said Clement died in the swamp. A fishing accident. His body never recovered. That was why they'd left Louisiana, why she'd never talked about the basin, why she'd burned his grandfather's letters when Eli was young. But Eli had saved a few, hidden them, and when she died last year, he'd finally read them. The last letter was dated 3 days before Clement vanished. It mentioned the dead water, the island, and something else. They're still using the old camp. I've seen the boats at night. I know what they're doing. God help me, I know. Eli stared at his grandfather's name carved into the wall. Then he heard the boats. There were 2 of them, flat-bottomed pirogues moving slow through the dead water, pulled by men who knew these channels better than Eli ever would. He counted 4 figures total, 2 in each boat. They hadn't seen him yet. Eli crouched behind the collapsed wall of the fishing camp, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through a gap in the rotted wood, he watched them approach. They weren't fishermen. He knew that immediately. Fishermen didn't move like that, silent, deliberate, scanning the water and the trees with the focus of predators. Fishermen didn't carry rifles across their laps. The boats slid past the island, close enough that Eli could hear the water dripping from their push-poles. One of the men said something in Cajun French, too low and fast for Eli to catch. Another laughed, a short, ugly sound. They continued into the swamp, disappearing behind a curtain of moss. Eli waited. 5 minutes, 10, 20. When he was sure they were gone, he moved. He crept back to his boat, trying to step where the ground was firmest, trying not to make a sound. The shotgun was still in the boat, tucked beneath the seat where he'd left it. Stupid, he should have brought it with him. He was 10 feet from the water when he saw what was floating next to his boat. A body, face down, arms spread, drifting in the brown water like a pale starfish. A man, maybe middle-aged, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. The back of his head was wrong, caved in, dark with blood that had turned the water around him rust-colored. Eli's stomach lurched. He grabbed a cypress knee to steady himself, and the wood crumbled beneath his grip, spilling him forward. He caught himself before he fell, but the sound, the splash of his hand hitting the water, was loud in the silence. Too loud. In the distance he heard voices. The boats were coming back. Eli didn't think. He moved on instinct, wading to his boat, climbing in, grabbing the shotgun, and then stopping. If he started the engine, they'd hear him. They'd find him, and he'd end up like the man floating in the water. Instead, he grabbed the push-pole strapped to the side of the John boat and shoved off from the island, driving the pole into the soft bottom, propelling himself into the thickest stand of cypress he could find. He pulled for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The trees grew so close together that he had to turn the boat sideways to squeeze through. Moss dragged across his face, his arms caught in his hair. The water grew shallower, darker, choked with hyacinth and duckweed. Behind him he heard the outboard engines start. They were searching. Eli kept moving. The shotgun lay across his knees, loaded, safety off. He didn't know if he could use it. He'd never shot at a person before. He'd never even shot at an animal. The engines grew closer, then farther, then closer again. They were circling, cutting off the channels, hurting him. The water ahead opened into a small clearing, a pond maybe 50 feet across, ringed by cypress. Eli stopped at the edge, hidden in the shadows of the trees. 2 boats emerged from the far side of the pond. The men saw him immediately. For a long moment, no one moved. Eli stared at them across the brown water. 4 men, weathered and hard, dressed in work clothes stained with mud and something darker. One of them, the oldest, with a gray beard and eyes like chips of flint, raised a hand. "Thibodeau," he called out. Not a question, a statement. Eli didn't answer. "Your granddaddy stuck his nose where it didn't belong," the man continued. "Looks like it runs in the family." "I don't want any trouble," Eli said. His voice sounded thin, reedy, not his own. "Then you shouldn't have come to the dead water." The man nodded to one of the others, who raised his rifle. Eli didn't think. He just fired. The shotgun kicked against his shoulder, and the blast tore through the silence like thunder. He didn't aim, just pointed in the general direction of the boats and squeezed the trigger. The men scattered. Someone screamed. Eli racked another shell, fired again, and then he was poling as hard as he could, driving the boat into the cypress on the far side of the pond, not caring about the branches that whipped his face or the roots that scraped the hull. Behind him, gunfire cracked. Bullets snapped through the leaves, punched into the water. The trees were too thick, the channels too narrow. They couldn't follow. Not easily. Eli kept moving. He pulled until his arms burned, until the dead water gave way to the main channels, until he saw the pipeline canal in the distance. Only then did he start the engine, opening the throttle all the way, flying across the brown water toward the bait shop and the dock and the highway beyond. He didn't stop until he reached Houston. The police didn't believe him. No body was found at the location he described, no island, no collapsed fishing camp. The dead water, they said, was just a local legend, an area of the basin where the water was too shallow and choked for good fishing. Nobody went there. Nobody. The old man at the bait shop was gone when investigators visited. The shop was closed, a faded "for sale" sign in the window. No one in town remembered anyone matching his description, and the shotgun Eli had taken, the one he was sure he'd fired twice, had a full magazine when the police examined it, unfired, clean. Eli still has his grandfather's letters. He reads them sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and his wife is asleep. The last one still haunts him. They're still using the old camp. I've seen the boats at night. I know what they're doing. God help me, I know. Clement never wrote what they were doing, and Eli never found out. But sometimes when he closes his eyes, he sees the names carved into that gray wood, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and he wonders how many are still being added. Danny almost missed the turn. The road wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees where the asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, then something that barely qualified as a path. His GPS had died 20 minutes ago, somewhere around the last cell tower, and now he was navigating by the hand-drawn map his co-worker had sketched on a napkin. Best trout fishing in the state, Rick had told him. My uncle's got a cabin up in the holler. Nobody knows about it. You'll have the whole river to yourself. The cabin was real, at least. Danny found it at the end of the dirt road, tucked into a fold of the mountain where two ridges came together like praying hands. It was old, hand-hewn logs, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged in the middle, but it looked solid enough. The key was under a rock by the door, just like Rick said. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and wood smoke and something else, something faintly sweet, faintly rotten. Danny opened the windows to air it out and tried not to think about it. He'd taken a week off work for this trip. His divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, and he needed to get away. Needed silence. Needed to stand in cold water and cast a line and not think about Jenny or the house they'd sold or the dog she'd taken. The Cranberry River was a 10-minute walk from the cabin, down a trail that wound through rhododendron thickets and old-growth hemlock. Danny followed it in the fading afternoon light, his rod over his shoulder, his waders slung across his back. The river was everything Rick had promised. Clear and cold, tumbling over rocks worn smooth by centuries of water. Danny could see trout holding in the pools, native brook trout, their flanks speckled with red and blue, their fins edged in white. He fished until dark, catching and releasing a dozen brookies, the biggest maybe 10 inches. By the time he hiked back to the cabin, his legs ached and his hands were numb. But for the first time in months, his mind was quiet. He built a fire in the wood stove, heated a can of soup, and sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the ridgeline. That's when he heard the singing. It came from somewhere up the holler, a woman's voice, high and thin, singing a melody Danny didn't recognize. The words were indistinct, swallowed by distance and the rustle of wind through the trees. Danny stood up, listening. The singing continued for maybe a minute. Then it stopped, cut off mid-phrase as if someone had closed a door. Danny waited, but it didn't start again. He went inside, locked the door, and told himself it was nothing. A neighbor, maybe. Another cabin somewhere up the mountain. Sound carried strangely in these hollows. He slept poorly that night. The next morning, Danny hiked upstream. Rick's map showed a waterfall about 2 miles up with a deep pool at its base. "The big ones live there," Rick had written. "Bring your A-game." The trail grew fainter as Danny climbed. The rhododendron pressed close, forming tunnels he had to duck through. The hemlocks gave way to red spruce, their branches heavy with moss. The air grew colder, damper. The sky disappeared behind the canopy. He found the waterfall around noon. It was beautiful, a 20-foot drop into a pool so clear he could see every stone on the bottom. The water was deep green in the center, shading to turquoise at the edges. Mist hung in the air, catching the light. But Danny barely noticed. He was looking at the woman standing on the opposite bank. She was old, 70 at least, maybe 80. Thin as a rail, dressed in a shapeless gray dress that hung to her ankles. Her hair was white and wild, uncombed, falling past her shoulders. She was staring at him. "Morning," Danny called out, his voice loud in the silence. The woman didn't respond, didn't move, just stared. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mist. "I'm staying at the cabin down the holler," he tried again. "Rick Brennan's uncle's place." At the name, something shifted in the woman's face. Her lips moved, but Danny couldn't hear what she said. He stepped closer to the water's edge. "Sorry, I didn't catch that." The woman raised one thin arm and pointed at him. Her hand was trembling. Her mouth moved again, and this time, carried by some trick of the acoustics, her words reached him clearly. "You shouldn't have come here." Then she turned and walked into the forest. Danny stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she'd disappeared. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense. He couldn't see any trail, any path, just green shadows and silence. He didn't fish the pool. Instead, he turned around and hiked back to the cabin, moving faster than he should have, his heart beating in his throat. That night, Danny heard the footsteps. They circled the cabin slowly, crunching on the dead leaves that covered the ground. He lay in the dark, listening, not daring to breathe. The footsteps paused at each window, lingered, then moved on, around and around. For hours, Danny didn't sleep. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, he went outside to check. The leaves around the cabin were disturbed, pressed down in a clear path that circled the structure. But there were no footprints, no shoe impressions, just flattened leaves, as if something heavy had dragged itself around the cabin in the dark. He thought about leaving, thought about packing his gear and driving back to civilization, back to cell service and streetlights and people. But something kept him there. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the need to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid, that the divorce hadn't broken something fundamental inside him. Or maybe it was something else, a pull he didn't understand, drawing him deeper into the holler. He fished that day, but his heart wasn't in it. He kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. The forest felt different now, watchful, aware. In the afternoon, he found the cemetery. It was off the main trail, hidden behind a stand of hemlocks, a small clearing with a dozen headstones, most of them so weathered the names had worn away. The stones were old, hand-carved, leaning at odd angles, but one was newer. It stood at the edge of the clearing, the granite still dark and polished. Danny walked over and read the inscription. "Brennan, our children, taken too soon." Below it, 5 names, 5 dates, all from the same week in 1987. Danny stared at the stone. Rick's last name was Brennan. His uncle's cabin, our children. He thought about the old woman by the waterfall, the singing in the dark, the footsteps circling the cabin. You shouldn't have come here. Danny turned and walked back to the cabin. He packed his gear in 15 minutes. He didn't bother cleaning up, didn't bother locking the door. He threw his bags in the truck and started the engine. The dirt road wound down the mountain, narrow and rutted. Danny drove too fast, his hands tight on the wheel. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping the truck like fingers. He came around a bend and slammed on the brakes. The old woman was standing in the middle of the road. She wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the trees, stood 5 children. They were pale, their clothes old-fashioned, their eyes dark hollows in their white faces. They didn't move, didn't blink. The old woman raised her hand, pointing at Danny the same way she had at the waterfall. Her mouth moved. Danny couldn't hear the words through the closed windows, but he could read her lips. "You took them from me." Danny's foot found the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward. The old woman didn't move, didn't flinch. And then she was gone, and the children were gone, and the road was empty. Danny didn't stop until he reached the highway. He called Rick the next day. "How was the fishing?" Rick asked. Danny didn't know how to answer. He asked about the cemetery instead, about the grave, about the 5 children. The line went quiet for a long time. "My uncle never told you the story," Rick finally said. "No. His sister, my great-aunt, she lived up in that holler her whole life, had 5 kids. In '87 there was a flood. The river came up fast, faster than anyone expected. The kids were playing down by the water." Rick paused. "They never found the bodies. The river took them. My great-aunt, she never recovered. Spent the rest of her life wandering those woods, looking for them. She died in '94, but the locals say—" He trailed off. "Say what?" Danny pressed. "They say she's still looking." Danny thought about the singing in the dark, the footsteps circling the cabin, the old woman on the road, the children standing silent behind her. "You took them from me." "Rick," Danny said slowly, "your great-aunt, what did she look like?" Rick described her. White hair, thin, a gray dress she wore every day, even in summer. Danny hung up without saying goodbye. He never went back to West Virginia. Never went fishing again, actually. The thought of standing in moving water, of feeling the current pull at his legs, made his chest tight and his vision swim. Sometimes, late at night, he still hears it. A woman's voice, high and thin, singing a melody he doesn't recognize, and beneath it, the sound of children laughing. The sun was already sinking when Miguel pushed off from the boat ramp at Chokolosky. He knew it was late, knew he should have left hours ago. But the job had run long, and the snook were running, and he'd been waiting 3 weeks for his schedule to line up with the tide charts. Besides, Miguel had fished these waters his whole life, 42 years. He'd learned to pole a skiff before he learned to drive a car. The 10,000 islands were in his blood. Every channel, every oyster bar, every mangrove island that looked like every other mangrove island to outsiders, but was distinct as a fingerprint to him. He didn't need daylight. The run out to his spot took 40 minutes. He threaded through the islands as the sky turned orange, then pink, then purple. The water was flat, mirror still, reflecting the colors above. Mullet jumped in the shallows. A great blue heron watched him pass, motionless as a statue. By the time he reached the sandbar, the first stars were appearing. Miguel anchored the skiff and set up his gear. 2 rods, one with a live pinfish, one with a soft plastic, a headlamp, red filtered to preserve his night vision, a cooler with water and a sandwich, his phone, which showed 1 bar of signal that flickered in and out. He made his first cast into the darkness. The night fishing was different out here, quieter. The sounds of the day, the birds, the boats, the distant hum of civilization faded away, replaced by something older, the slap of water against the hull, the rustle of wind through the mangroves, the occasional splash of a predator striking in the shallows. Miguel loved it. The solitude, the focus, the feeling of being alone in a world that had looked exactly like this for 10,000 years. He caught 2 snook in the first hour, good ones, both over the slot, fat and silver, fighting hard in the warm water. He released them carefully, watching them disappear into the black. Around 10 o'clock, the wind died. It happened all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment there was a light breeze from the southwest, just enough to keep the mosquitoes at bay. The next, nothing. The air went still, heavy, thick with humidity. Miguel wiped the sweat from his forehead and kept fishing. That's when he heard the splash. It came from behind him, maybe 50 yards away. Too big for a mullet, too loud for a snook. Miguel turned, shining his headlamp across the water. Nothing. Just black water, flat as glass, reflecting the red beam back at him. He waited. Listened. Silence. He turned back to his rods and froze. There was something in the water next to his skiff. It was just below the surface, a shape, pale and indistinct, maybe 6 feet long. It wasn't moving, just hovering there, suspended in the black water, close enough that Miguel could have reached out and touched it. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The shape drifted closer, and then it was gone, sinking down, disappearing into the depths, without a ripple, without a sound. Miguel stood there for a long time, his heart pounding, his headlamp cutting a red swathe across the empty water. Manatee, he told himself, had to be a manatee. They were common out here, curious, known to approach boats. But manatees didn't move like that, didn't hover motionless, didn't sink straight down without surfacing to breathe. Miguel pulled his anchor and started the motor. He couldn't find the channel. That was impossible. He'd run this route hundreds of times in daylight and darkness, in calm weather and storms. The channel between the sandbar and Chokolosky was as familiar to him as the hallway of his own house. But nothing looked right. The mangrove islands seemed to have shifted, rearranged themselves in the dark. Channels he expected to find were blocked by oyster bars. Openings he didn't recognize appeared where solid land should have been. Miguel cut the engine and drifted, trying to get his bearings. The stars were wrong too. He'd navigated by stars since he was a boy. Polaris to the north, Orion in the winter sky, the Southern Cross low on the horizon. But tonight, the constellations were scrambled, familiar patterns broken apart, stars where no stars should be. Miguel grabbed his phone. The signal was gone, the screen showing no service in the corner. He opened his GPS app anyway, hoping for a cached map, but the screen just showed his location as a blue dot in a field of gray. No landmarks, no channels, nothing. He was lost. Miguel had never been lost in these waters. Never. The thought was almost more frightening than whatever he'd seen in the water. He took a breath, tried to think. The tide was going out. If he followed the current, it would lead him toward open water, toward the Gulf. From there, he could follow the coast north to Chokolosky. It would take longer, but it would work. He started the motor and let the current guide him. The mangroves slid past in the darkness, silver gray in the starlight, their roots tangled and grasping. The water grew shallower, then deeper, then shallow again. Nothing made sense. And then he heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, calling from somewhere in the mangroves. "Help me." Miguel cut the engine, listening. "Please, help me." The voice was faint, strained, like someone who'd been calling for a long time. It came from his left, from a narrow channel between two islands. "Hello?" Miguel called back. "Where are you?" "Here, I'm here, please." He didn't think. He just turned the skiff and motored toward the voice. The channel was tight, barely wide enough for his boat. Mangrove branches scraped the hull, snagged his shirt. The darkness was absolute here, his headlamp barely penetrating the tangle of roots and leaves. "Keep talking," he called out. "I'm coming." "Here, I'm right here." The voice was closer now, just ahead, around the next bend. Miguel pushed through a curtain of branches and emerged into a small lagoon. It was empty. No boat, no person, just black water ringed by mangroves, still as death. "Hello?" Miguel called. Silence. Then the voice came again, but this time it was behind him. "Why did you leave me?" Miguel spun around. There was a woman standing in his skiff. She was pale, her skin gray-white in the light of his headlamp. Her hair was dark, plastered to her face, as if she'd just surfaced from the water. Her clothes, a simple dress, colorless and shapeless, clung to her body, dripping. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, black, like the water, like the sky. Miguel stumbled backward, nearly falling over the gunwale. "Who are you?" he managed. The woman tilted her head. Water ran down her face like tears. "You don't remember me. I've never seen you before in my life. You left me here." Her voice was different now, harder, colder. 30 years ago, you said you'd come back. I don't know what you're talking about." "Miguel." She said his name, and something in her voice made his blood freeze. "Miguel Reyes, you promised." He stared at her. He didn't recognize her face, her voice, anything about her, but she knew his name, knew his full name. "I think you've got the wrong person," he said, his voice shaking. The woman smiled. Her teeth were wrong, too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark's. "There is no wrong person, Miguel. There's only the water, and what the water remembers." She stepped toward him. Miguel lunged for the motor, yanked the cord, and the engine roared to life. He didn't care about the direction, didn't care about the shallow water or the oyster bars or the mangrove roots. He just opened the throttle and ran. Behind him he heard the splash. He didn't look back. They found him the next morning. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted the skiff, drifting in open water about 3 miles west of Chokoloski. Miguel was curled in the bottom of the boat, unresponsive, his skin cold despite the Florida heat. He'd run out of gas sometime in the night. The motor was burned out, run too hard for too long. There was damage to the hull, deep gouges in the fiberglass, as if something had been clawing at the boat from below. Miguel spent 2 days in the hospital. Dehydration, they said, exposure, possible hallucinations from heat stroke. He didn't argue with them. When his wife came to pick him up, she found him sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, staring at the wall. "Mijo," she said, "what happened out there?" Miguel was quiet for a long time. "Do you remember," he finally said, "when we were young, before we got married? I used to fish with a girl, Carmen something. We dated for a while." His wife frowned. "I remember. Carmen Vega. She disappeared, didn't she? Went out fishing one night and never came back. They never found her. When was that?" "I don't know, 30 years ago? Around the time we started dating." She paused. "Why?" Miguel didn't answer. He sold the skiff the following week, gave away his fishing gear, took a job at his brother-in-law's auto shop, something that kept him far from the water. He never told anyone what he saw that night, but sometimes when he's lying in bed and the house is quiet, he hears it, a woman's voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere far away. "Why did you leave me?" And the black water, always the black water, rising up to meet him in his dreams.